Gulf Air Flight 072, an Airbus A320, was scheduled to make the short journey from Cairo International Airport to Bahrain International Airport on the evening of August 23, 2000. With 143 souls on board, 135 passengers, and 8 crew members, it was a routine flight for one of the Middle East's leading airlines. The weather was clear, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary as the pilots completed their pre-flight checklists. Captain Iyad Mahmoud Kiki and First Officer Khalid al-Shahabi were at the controls. Captain Kiki was an experienced pilot, but First Officer al-Shahabi, though capable, had far fewer hours on the A320. The two had flown together before, but what neither of them knew was that this flight would be their last. After a smooth takeoff, from Cairo at 16:52 UTC, Flight 072 climbed to 35,000 feet, heading southeast across the Arabian Gulf. The aircraft was operating normally, with passengers relaxing, enjoying in-flight entertainment, or conversing quietly in their seats. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, ensuring everyone was comfortable. It was just another day in the skies, but just over an hour later, as the aircraft began its final approach to Bahrain, things would take a disastrous turn. As Flight 072 neared Bahrain, Air Traffic Control, ATC, instructed the pilots to begin their descent. The aircraft steadily descended from 35,000 feet to 14,000 feet, preparing for landing on runway 12 at Bahrain International Airport. The pilots were aware of some turbulence and low visibility haze, but were confident in their ability to land safely. However, as they descended further, confusion began creeping into the cockpit. ATC had instructed them to descend to 2,500 feet, but the aircraft overshot the required altitude and continued descending too rapidly. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, issued a warning, but the pilots, distracted by adjusting their approach, ignored it momentarily. The aircraft was still too high for a proper landing and needed to realign with the runway. The solution should have been simple: execute a standard go-around procedure and try the approach again. But this is where everything went wrong. At 19:29 UTC, Captain Kiki, realizing they were too high and misaligned with the runway, made the decision to go around. This meant aborting the landing attempt and circling back for another approach. A go-around is a common maneuver, but what happened next was far from normal. Instead of smoothly climbing back to a safe altitude, the aircraft began an unstable, erratic ascent. The engine surged as Captain Kiki pulled back aggressively on the controls, causing the aircraft's nose to pitch dangerously high. First Officer al-Shahabi noticed the extreme pitch angle and began calling out altitude warnings, but the captain, hyper-focused on climbing, failed to correct it. The aircraft shot upward at an alarming rate, and within seconds the stall warning system blared through the cockpit. "Stall! Stall!" the onboard computer announced, signaling that the aircraft was losing lift and was about to drop. Passengers in the cabin felt a sudden weightlessness as the aircraft lurched upward, then violently shuddered. Some grabbed their seats in panic, sensing something was very wrong. Flight attendants held on to anything they could, trying to reassure passengers as chaos unfolded in the cockpit. Captain Kiki, in a moment of misjudgment, pulled back even harder on the controls, sealing the aircraft's fate. The Airbus A320 stalled completely. At 19:30 UTC, the aircraft stopped climbing and entered a deadly nosedive. The stall warning continued to blare in the cockpit, but now the problem was reversed. The aircraft was no longer going up. It was plummeting downward at an uncontrollable speed. At 2,500 feet, the pilots should have had enough altitude to recover, but Captain Kiki hesitated, struggling against the rapidly increasing gravitational forces. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, activated, screaming, "Pull up! Pull up!" In a desperate final attempt, First Officer al-Shahabi pushed forward on the controls, but it was too late. The aircraft was falling at over 3,000 feet per minute, and there was nothing they could do. Seconds before impact, passengers screamed. Flight attendants braced themselves, and in the cockpit, the realization of impending doom set in. At 19:31 UTC, Gulf Air Flight 072 slammed into the waters of the Arabian Gulf, just miles short of Bahrain International Airport. Within minutes, search and rescue teams were dispatched to the crash site. The wreckage of Flight 072 was scattered in the shallow waters off the coast of Bahrain. There were no survivors. All 143 people on board perished in what should have been a routine landing. Investigators recovered the black boxes and soon uncovered the tragic sequence of errors. The go-around was mishandled, leading to an overly steep climb. The aircraft stalled, and instead of lowering the nose to regain speed, the captain pulled back, worsening the stall. By the time the pilots realized the mistake, they had no altitude left to recover. Further analysis showed that fatigue may have played a role. Captain Kiki had exceeded duty hours in previous months, possibly leading to impaired decision-making. The accident led to major changes in pilot training, focusing on proper go-around procedures, stall recovery training, fatigue management protocols to prevent exhausted pilots from flying critical routes. Gulf Air completely overhauled its pilot training programs, ensuring that no such accident would ever happen again. But for the families of the victims, no safety reform could bring back their loved ones. The tragic loss of Flight 072 was a stark reminder that even the simplest mistakes in aviation can have devastating consequences. Gulf Air Flight 072 was seconds from safety, but one mistake turned it into a catastrophe. As the sun rose over the Arabian Gulf, search and rescue teams scoured the crash site for any trace of survivors. Divers and naval units worked tirelessly, pulling pieces of the wreckage from the water, hoping to recover the black boxes. The families of the victims gathered at Bahrain International Airport, their faces etched with fear and devastation, desperate for any news about their loved ones. Hours later, investigators located the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and flight data recorder, FDR, both heavily damaged but still recoverable. These devices would soon reveal the harrowing moments leading up to the crash and uncover the fatal mistakes that sealed the fate of Flight 072. The world waited as aviation experts and forensic analysts began reconstructing the final seconds of the doomed flight. What they found was more shocking than anyone had anticipated. The CVR recordings painted a tragic picture of confusion, miscommunication, and panic inside the cockpit. The investigators heard the pilots' frantic voices, the sound of alarms, blaring, and most heartbreakingly, the realization of their mistake. Too late to fix it. Captain Kiki had been overwhelmed by the series of rapid decisions required in the final moments. His delayed reactions and overcorrections had put the aircraft in a position where recovery was impossible. First Officer Al-Shahabi, who might have saved the aircraft, had hesitated to challenge the captain's authority, a cultural factor that played a critical role in the disaster. Investigators now understood. This was a preventable crash. As news of the investigation findings spread, public outcry followed. Families demanded answers from Gulf Air and aviation regulators. How could such a routine flight end in disaster? Memorial services were held across Bahrain, Egypt, and other affected nations. The grief-stricken relatives clung to memories of their lost loved ones, questioning whether better training or stricter safety regulations could have prevented the crash. Gulf Air's CEO issued a public statement, promising reforms and pledging to support the families. But for many, it was not enough. The deep loss would remain forever. The investigation prompted major changes in the airline industry. Gulf Air revamped its pilot training programs, making it mandatory for pilots to undergo enhanced stall recovery training and go-around procedures. Additionally, crew resource management, CRM training was overhauled, emphasizing that first officers should be empowered to challenge captains in critical situations. Hierarchical barriers inside cockpits had contributed to multiple aviation disasters, and Flight 072 was another grim reminder of the consequences. International aviation authorities, including the FAA and ICAO, took note. Airlines across the globe were urged to revise their approach training procedures, ensuring that pilots could execute go-arounds correctly without confusion. Flight 072 was now a case study for pilots in training, a chilling lesson in how small errors, when left unchecked, could spiral into catastrophe. Years after the crash, the lessons from Gulf Air Flight 072 continued to shape aviation safety policies. Pilots trained differently, first officers were given more authority in decision-making, and passenger safety was prioritized above all. For the families of the victims, no amount of safety improvements could erase their pain. Every year on August 10th, a memorial was held in Bahrain, honoring those who had lost their lives. Flight 072 would never be forgotten. Its impact was felt far beyond the airline. It changed